All right, so we're going to make the shift from the literary criticism of Lewis, which I gave you a very short example of by taking the discarded image, and that was for setting the stage, just giving you an example of his mature literary criticism. I could have chosen all sorts of works, which I have found greatly beneficial, like Preface to Paradise Lost, and the first work that I actually read, which was The Allegory of Love. But his introduction to literature, 16th century literature, excluding drama, is still cited by scholars, brilliant. And all of Lewis's literary criticism, I find, is useful to students. It's not ideologically driven. Its purpose is there to help you appreciate the literature, which is, to me, what the critic ought to be doing. Obviously, there's some meta-reflection on it, and in the context of what I do at Tyndale, I try to frame it as a Christian. How do we see this not only from the vantage point of understanding it, but what are we to think of it as Christians? I add that. Lewis doesn't add that in general. In the Academy, in his works, he doesn't make comments there, at least in the criticism itself. He makes comments elsewhere where it seems appropriate. So he separates the two, and I'm going to take them, his various types of writing, and separate them out as well. And we're going to move into fiction now with that framework in place from the discarded image, which will then bring to bear here. And one of the things that we need to remind ourselves here then is the cosmology that we left off with. Oh dear. Every time I click on this, it opens up other things and then things I don't want. And it was that small? Seriously? There you go. That cosmology, which he said was classical, and described ours as romantic, which I found very interesting and telling, and actually accurate in many ways. Our perspective, the perspective of romanticism, whereby everything revolves around us, and it's taken from the vantage point of the seeing, outward seeing person, which I showed to you last time in that Caspar David Friedrich portrait of the man standing on the mountaintop looking outwards. That's the vantage point of the romantic that tends to be our vantage point. And that perspective is itself a worldview, which I said to you deserves to be questioned. And the best way to question it is to see from the vantage point of a different worldview, and then you can actually see what's deficient in one, and also and the other, obviously, but also what commends that worldview to us or doesn't. And Lewis, it seems to me, in his fiction, is seriously leaning into his medieval discarded image, and he's holding on to it to some degree. And I've already given you a couple of indications why I think that is, and with references to the last battle and Aslan's call for the children to go further up and further in, which is nothing other than an appeal to this cosmology, whereby they're not only going upwards, which is no problem for us to understand, but also going inwards into the city of God, which we would say lies outside of us, because we think we're on the inside and God's on the outside, and he's in outer space, whereas we're in a place that's utterly solid and real. And in Lewis's fiction, he is at pains to regularly contradict those sensibilities from the romantic framework, and be more biblical and classical, for that matter, in suggesting that God, unlike us, is eternal, utterly real. His reality is the reality that is unchanging, and ours is, as the Bible says in Ecclesiastes, it's vanity. It's like a puff of wind. Chevel. It's gone. All men are like grass. And whereas God is chavod, he's heavy, he's solid, he's substantial, utterly real. We'll look at that when we come to the Great Divorce. That's his portrait of heaven there. And he has to push against the sensibilities once again of the romantic model, that we simply default to as our way of thinking about these things, which is why many people think that God's existence is something that we have to imagine, but we have no evidence for whatsoever. And again, Lewis begs to differ, and he will push against that in a myriad of ways. But in his fiction, which we're pivoting to now, I want to deal with something I know that Dr. Davis has talked about with you already, which is the motive for writing fiction. Because he moves from a phase when he's writing apologetic works, one of which we're going to look at later on, Mere Christianity, in the broadcast talks that he delivered during the Second World War, and the Abolition of Man, and a few other defenses of the Christian faith. And in the context of the Socratic Club, defeated all comers, basically. Lewis was the center of the Socratic Club that he started in Oxford. And just like he was with the Inklings, he was just that sort of magnetic personality. And then there was this famed incident with Elizabeth Anscombe in which Lewis allegedly thought that he had been defeated. And Dr. Davis takes issue with this caricature, and I know he has presented that to you, and I won't recapitulate what he says. I'm also minded to the same thing, by the way. I don't think that Lewis took it as devastatingly as biographers and others have hence taken it to explain this move towards writing fiction. And I'm going to give you an alternative view of that right now. But the man who presented this most strongly is this man, A.N. Wilson. C.S. Lewis, A Biography, The Classic Life of the Author Who Created Narnia. And there's Jack as a young boy with his little animals. And it's a very good biography. A.N. Wilson, who has subsequently, I believe, come to faith, but for a long time wrote biographies about Christian thinkers, and they were very critical, including one of Jesus, one of Paul, one of Tolkien. But he's an excellent writer. And it was his contention that Lewis, in this famous exchange with A.N. Wilson, met this young philosopher by the name of Elizabeth Anscombe. She read a paper claiming that Lewis's argument was essentially flawed. And those who were present remember a vigorous debate between the two of them. And it has to be said that not all philosophers agree with Anscombe's position, and my colleague Dr. Davis is one of them. He thinks that her position is actually weaker than Lewis's. His argument is better. And but the standard take, and that is that of Wilson, is that he was beaten, and nobody bested Lewis. But now we have a young Christian philosopher introducing a line of argumentation which would be new to him, because it was coming from a school of philosophy that was unknown to him at the time, from Wittgenstein and so forth. And because of this humiliating defeat at the hands of no less than a woman, and they make a great heavy weather of the fact that she was a woman, although we have no indications whatsoever that Lewis is a misogynist, which is the implicit charge here, and that, you know, he just couldn't deal with, in terms of his ego, that a woman had bested him. He then shifted to fiction. That's the narrative for it. I don't think that, one, she did beat him. Secondly, that was the motivation for him shifting to fiction. And thirdly, that he was misogynist. I don't buy any of that stuff. I see no evidence for it. But that has been what has been alleged, and I find Christians swallow this narrative hook, line, and sinker. Probably because people don't like saints. And Lewis is no saint. But there is a sort of a hagiography that's arisen around Lewis, that everything he writes is perfect at whatever, and we want a few chinks in the armor. I'm not trying to suggest that he doesn't have chinks. I just don't. This portrait, I think, is questionable at any rate. Let's put it that way. I don't think that's the motivation. The motivation, I think, is that he had always intended on engaging with the very sorts of things that he does engage with in the Chronicles of Narnia, namely the education system and what it's like to be a child, and thinking about what we've just looked at, the discarded image, as a way of looking at the world more conducive to the children's observations of the Tao everywhere. So we began with the framing of the abolition of man and then the discarded image. Both works are there because I think Lewis, and he begins Mere Christianity as well with the discussion of the Tao, just not in those terms, by observing that children, one of the first things you do on the playground is observe children saying to other children, that's not fair, even though they're very young. And when they say this, they expect that the child to whom they've said that's not fair knows full well that what fairness is, and that they don't have to explain what fairness is because they both intuit what fairness is. It's not a product of reasoning, it's a product of intuition, intellection. Again, last time in the discarded image, I talked about intellect, what is intellectual preceding the rational. That's also embedded in this whole discussion. So again, we have to start seeing things from a different vantage point, not begin with the romantic viewpoint of Immanuel Kant, because Kant effectively just provides a philosophical framework that embeds romanticism in it. He calls it, by the way, in the Critique of Pure Reason, he posits it as a Copernican turn, fascinatingly, right at the beginning. Says, imagine if the world outside is conformed to our capacity to perceive it rather than the other way around. It would be categories of thinking that would be the solid things and not something out there which is objective, solid, real, etc. Objectivity lies within the mind rather than outside of it. There's no objective cosmos. Lewis intensely disagrees with that framework. He is on side with not only the objectivity of what we'll call the moral law, but the objectivity and the goodness of the created order. And that's what he wants to defend as well. And his contemporaries, on the contrary, are at pains to suggest that the created order is something that is less solid, less real, and is something that we largely construct with our minds. And therefore we can alter it, like a magician. And so that will lead us into the magician's nephew. So that's my opening to this. Is I think that this take on Lewis's fiction as a retreat, licking his wounds from being beaten by a young woman, Catholic at that. Maybe we can add a little bit of religious bigotry to the portrait if we want, just to show how bad he was, or deal with childhood traumas. He's a bachelor, doesn't know how to handle women. Again, contradicted by countless information that we have from his treatment of others, including Mrs. Moore, whom some, including Christian biographers, will allege he had an affair with, despite the fact that there's no evidence for this whatsoever, and it would contradict everything we know about the man, literally everything. And there's no evidence for it. His brother, who also lived with her, denies that there was anything of that. You might say, well, he's his brother, he's protecting him. I think, yeah, but you would come out somewhere. It comes out. And there's zero evidence for it. It's just, again, insinuation. I think it's disgraceful. It's just slanderous. So if we're not going to go that route, and I'm not going to go that route, and again, I commend the biography to you. I just think that on certain points, Wilson is speculating, and here's one of them, and it's wrong. And Christians have tended to follow Wilson's portrait of why he shifts here. It's explanatory. There's this decisive episode. What would be the reason then? Well, the reason would be, as I said, he wants to deal with the formative period in a child's life. Thinking about his own period, and thinking about also how one comes to faith. And he's writing it concurrent with Surprised by Joy. Thinking about himself, in other words. That's his sort of autobiographical sketch. By the way, the line Surprised by Joy is from Wordsworth, whom he greatly admired. Again, a romantic, but talking about the goodness of childhood affections and the moral framework of the child being essentially intact. In other words, even though Wordsworth is a romantic, he has a sense of the moral objectivity of the child's observations of the world. In other words, the child acknowledges the Tao. It's the adults that deny the Tao. And that's interesting as well. It tends to be denied by contemporary scholars. So how then do we understand this if not as a retreat into imaginary worlds? So he can't deal with reality anymore, Mr. Lewis, and the tough and tumble of academic debate. He's going to go back and he's going to pout like a child and write for children, of which he's one, along with his exploded Christian theological views. So we'll just retreat to that, because that's what's being said. This is just children's fiction. By the way, you don't read C.S. Lewis in the universities, or J.R.R. Tolkien. Most popular writers of the 20th century, Tolkien, the most popular by popular view, popular acclaim, you don't read them in the academy. You can read almost any scribbler of the 20th century, but you won't read the most popular ones, the ones that are seem to also have something about them that's worthy of engaging with. You just won't read them. And that in itself is also interesting and telling. So what is it then? I think that to guide us in this, we want to appeal to another work. This man, Michael Ward, who is an Anglican minister, author of this book, which presented the view that I thought of years ago. I'm not going to say that I thought of it first, because I have no idea, but I observed that the Chronicles of Narnia had a framework to them that was sevenfold, obviously, and that if you look at the discarded image, he talks about the significance of the number 7 and connects it to the heavens. And I know something about the heavens as well and what it's associated with, like the planets and the metals and the influences of them and the deities associated with it, and it just maps out. And so Ward suggests that the 7 heavens in the imagination of C.S. Lewis parse out into the 7 books of the Chronicles of Narnia. And I think the thesis is generally correct. So Lewis at one point says that the whole Narnia series is about Christ, but that seems like a bit of a stretch, because he also will deny that Aslan is Christ. And when one young girl writes him and says that, and confesses that she loves Aslan more than Christ, Lewis is very upset for leading a child astray, potentially. He's very bothered by this fact. And I have friends who read this, and I did not read the Chronicles of Narnia as a child, but who told me, and these are people who are not believers, but even as believers who read it and had no idea that it related to Christ, which I found very odd. I don't know how you could, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, like, you don't see that as like, that one's really conspicuous. How did you not see that? If they're Christians. But if they're not Christians, I guess. But they read it and they enjoyed it without the Christian theology being pushed down their throats, which is how they say it to me. Well, you're pushing an agenda here by reading it this way. And I think, well, Lewis himself says this, but I'm going to grant you can read it without that and enjoy it. But you comment.
So it makes sense that a child, even a Christian child, reading the line of Witch and Wardrobe wouldn't necessarily connect it to Christ and the cross, because you see these two separate things. It's only when you're getting older and start to connect the dots that you see exactly.
Yes. So I think you're right. When children read this, they don't immediately connect it to Christ unless it's being read to them by Christians. And the Christians are thumping the child over the head and saying, this is about Jesus, it's about Jesus. And I think, no, it's not, actually. It's about a fictional character who has resemblances to Christ in certain respects. And so that we could grant that, and we'll come to this next lecture when we talk about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But even if we want to grant that, the whole of the Chronicles of Narnia, what does that have to do about Christ? Because he says the whole series is about Christ. I mean, there are biblical parallels in the character of Aslan, and he redeems it and he eventually judges it. But where is the reference to Pentecost? Like, is it conspicuous in the books? It's important. The birth narrative of Christ, the miraculous, is that in Narnia? It's not there. When Aslan enters the story among dancing trees and Prince Caspians, and he gives a war cry, and then when he flies in a sunbeam in the voyage of the Dawn Treader, and he doesn't appear at all in the silver chair, what do we make of that if it's a Christian story? And the answer is it can still be a Christian story, but that's not the only frame of reference here. And one of the main frames of reference is this, the cosmological framework, which Lewis sees embedded in that story. And so that's the helpful way of framing it that, again, Michael Ward presents to us. Apparently random, but I think is actually very careful, very painstaking, and I think helps us guide us to read it properly. Although note to self on this, when we come to the Magician's Nephew, this is not the first story, although we're going to read it first, in terms of the chronology in which it was written. It's the 6th. He wrote it just before the last battle. So he wrote the first in the series and the last book in the series at the tail end of it, thinking of a way of framing it. So did he have in mind from the beginning, here are the 7 books I'm going to write? Well, if you read his accounts of it, the answer is no, he didn't. But I think eventually they fall into place. I don't think he had it mapped out. I'm going to do this, and this one will be about creation, because the Magician's Nephew deals with the creation narrative, and the last battle deals with the second coming, as it were, an eschatological vision. In between, he's dealt with all sorts of stuff, but he didn't have that framing, and now he gives the framing. He gives the framing right at the end. The beginning and the end come right at the end of his whole chronology. He decides that's what's going to link it all together. So that's I don't think it's the hole in the thesis, but it's the weakness of the thesis of Ward, is to suggest that that was the plan from the very beginning. And I'm not totally sold on it, because it just doesn't seem to fit. It's not quite as planned as all that, but it's not to dispute it entirely. But we're going to read this one first, even though, as I said, it's the 6th of 7 novels published, because it's the prequel to the whole series. The middle third of the book will deal with the creation of the Narnia world by Aslan and the lion. So if you didn't think that Aslan was Christ, then you're ignoring John's gospel and the reference to the Word being the creator of all things. And the reference to the emperor over the sea will be a reference presumably to the Father. Occasionally reference to the emperor over the sea. He doesn't appear in the novel at all. But and the centerpiece of that is the section of a lamppost brought by accidental observers from London in the year 1900, which then we meet in the first novel he wrote, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You think, well, what's the lamppost being there? Because it's totally random. Okay, so hold on, back against what you said, Dr. Masson. That lamppost was really significant in that story, and there's a total randomness. How did it get there? So did he have it in his mind all along, and he just didn't want to deal with it in terms of as a story? He wanted to get right into the middle of the story right away, and if he did, then that would be the way an epic would be written. You're getting right into the middle of things, right at the beginning. So there's within his own mind, there's a way of telling this story, and he is, to some degree, he knows that the lamppost is important in some way. It's very important, in fact, because that's where the children are going to come back to this, and they disappear, and they become adults, and so it's exceptionally important. The lamppost is not random, and it's placed right here in the center of this prequel. And what happens in The Magician's Nephew is that the visitors participate in the beginning of Narnia's whole history, 1,000 years before The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So what this is then a frame story. It has a framework. It's called a frame narrative. Sometimes you could call it a portal fantasy. So you go in, just like the wardrobe. You enter into this first, and then everything else opens up. Here's the frame narrative. It has 2 children, however, not 4, and they're 2 different children, obviously, than the 4 that become the centerpieces of most of the Narnia series. And obviously so, if it's 1,000 years before that. Of course, they're 2 different children. And they are involved in an experimental travel through the wood between the worlds. And what we have then is something like, which has become very popular in the fiction of the 20th century, as we know from the Marvel superhero comics, we have the theory of a multiverse. That's what we have. And in this, he is following the physics of his day. He's not following the fiction of the medieval Renaissance period or anything that lies before it. The theory of a multiverse is a different way of looking at things than the romantic cosmology, which is how he describes not this one, but ours. The one where we're looking outward from our perspective. That's the cosmos. Right? The heliocentric model, the sun at the center. We're moving around at great speed. We don't see that, but you know what? The reality doesn't need to conform to our capacities to perceive it. Or rather, it does conform to our capacities to perceive it, but the reality lies in here, in the mind. That's the reality. Right? The categories of understanding are the reality. That's why psychology becomes the queen of the sciences. Right? And so, but the multiverse questions that perspective. So it's a third way of looking at it. So there is the Ptolemaic geocentric cosmology. There's the heliocentric cosmology of Galileo and Copernicus. And then there's the multiverse that might think we need to think of this in a different way altogether, on a different plane, different realities. And he entertains that, and he's not the only one. As I say, 20th century writers are very intrigued by the idea of a multiverse, which probably comes from Einstein's theory of relativity and so forth. And quantum physics and quantum realities and quantum math and so forth. So he's now introducing a third way of looking at the idea of worldview into the mix. That's what he's doing here. So if you think this is just children's fiction, you're missing the sophistication of his engagement with the whole topic by introducing the very idea of a multiverse. So even though it's written to children in language that children will appreciate and do love, he's also appealing to the adults of his day, for the thinking public. And so the multiverse shows Narnia and our middle-aged world now, so the world in which Lewis is writing in the 20th century. We have a planet that's been around for a while. But there are other multiverses in which this planet was younger, and also those in which it's older. And he will visit those in The Magician's Nephew and show what the outcome of that is. And he'll explore that in his sci-fi trilogy as well. There are certain planets that are older than ours and certain that are younger. And the younger one is that of Paralandra, of Venus, whereas Malacandra is an old world. It's an old world, and it existed before the incarnation. Before the incarnation. So again, he's dealing with not just different planets as Ward would have it, and the sevenfold heavens, but the idea of time and other possibilities. So this thesis is correct, but it's missing some of the subtlety of Lewis's cosmology, which is comparing 3 cosmologies. Ours, the romantic, the new one of multiverses, quantum physics and so forth, and the old one, which we spent time acquainting ourselves with when we looked at the discarded image. So Lewis began this book, by the way, soon after completing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So that's also interesting. So he began this because a question that a friend asked, you know, why is there a lamppost in the middle of nowhere? Like, it's important to this story, but it's like, how did it get there? And so there are bits of it that are autobiographical, I think. We could trace those out. But a number of themes are of general moral and Christian significance. And, and we get the idea of the atonement. We get the idea of original sin in this book. I said it's the creation account, but it's not just the creation account. There's an account of original sin. And we get the temptation, and we get fall. And we get the idea of the order of nature, the moral order of nature that is implicated in the fall that takes place in this account. Interesting. All of those things. And all of those there are sketched out, but he doesn't complete the story. He sets it to one side. But that's enough in his mind, having sketched out the importance of the previous story, to set that cosmos to one side of the whole multiverse for a time. I'll come back to that. I know it's central, but I'm going to come back to that when the time comes. And let me move on from there. So that's what he does. I do think he has an idea of it, but it's not this that determines it. It's not the sevenfold. It's the multiverse model. That's my suggestion. I've never read this anywhere else, by the way. This is my theory for it. And I think I'm right. Of course. I don't need to summarize the plot for you here because you've all read it and it's pretty well known. Where I want to begin with is maybe the beginning and some of the key episodes of the beginning, and also draw your attention to the fact of something that I think is really, really important in Lewis's fiction, and that is the world in which he lives, which is a middle-aged world, and the governance of this world by the scientists. So in other words, he's dealing with the very thing that we talked about in The Abolition of Man. That's the world that he lives in, where the scientists are now the sages. And there's been a collapse of science, scientia and sapientia. And the implication is that science can replace wisdom, and science can replace virtue. And remember, I said to you that Lewis is castigated by later writers for being the defenders of the literatures of freedom and virtue. When I say castigated, he is castigated for it. He's not identified with it, praised for being the defender. He's saying he's defending an old way of living life that we no longer need, because what we want to do is have a managed reality in which the conditioners are controlling all of these things. And until we can get rid of the idea of freedoms and liberties native to human nature and virtues that will defend these things, then this is an impediment to conditioning. The people will not want to give themselves over to the conditioning that we, the scientists, want to give them to make them happy. The Harvard psychologist, classical conditioner, attacks Lewis precisely on this point. So it begins with a quarrel, not with science, but with pseudoscience, and he calls it then pseudoscience. The scientists of his day are engaging in something, and Lewis has no problem with science. In fact, science is knowledge, but it's a false form of knowledge based on faulty foundations, and the faulty foundations are those of the Romantic. I got to put that up. The image is too good. Do I have it here? No, I don't. Caspar, David, Painter. There we go. There we go. That's our cosmology. And the effect of this cosmology is to efface the person's face from it. Now, when we come to the work, till we have faces, you'll note the significance of faces. the effect of the cosmology of the romantic is the face doesn't matter anymore. What's inside the person's mind is what matters, but the person. And we have feelings. This is a sublime landscape. It makes you feel a certain reverence and awe looking out on it. And that's the aesthetic category par excellence in the Romantic period, is the sublime. That is the sublime landscape, and we're looking at it, but we are not important to that. Our minds are. Our capacity to perceive the sublimity in the landscape is there. Remember, Lewis in The Abolition of Man begins with the discussion about the difference between the sublime and the beautiful, and whether if it was just a matter of feeling, just. Right? That's how he began the whole thing. But this novel, don't do that, begins with a very odd episode of two children, one of whom has gone through the wrong door. That's how it begins. Note that there's doors in this. There are little portals, entry points. We know the importance of the wardrobe in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But even here it begins with the door, and the door is a place where you enter to think and see things differently, which is how I've tried to introduce this course in some ways. We're going to look at Lewis as a man that leads us through a door that helps us to see things from a different vantage point. And the different vantage point will mean not from this vantage point. Go away. Stop looking at things from this vantage point, although we can't help it because all of our contemporaries look at the world this way, just like you do when you look online, social media, except you can see your face, but still it's looking outward. You're looking outward. This is inward, this is outwards. Who thinks about looking outward when they look on the world? Do you think about looking outward? Of course you do. He's going to give us ways of looking at things by going through a different door. And Pauly and Diggory, whose names arise here, come from this engagement by going through the wrong door. Now, this idea of modern education clothing itself in scientific language without undergoing the severities of scientific method is actually characterized by Uncle Andrew. So he's a scientist, note. But he's an odd sort of scientist who uses magic. He's got these magical rings. Now, he found the magical rings, and he's willing to use the magical rings. And what he demonstrates, and this becomes clear as we engage with Uncle Andrew, is that Uncle Andrew isn't actually interested in science, he's interested in power. And he will observe that this is and he says this both in The Discarded Image and his introduction to 16th century literature, that the rise of interest in magic is concurrent with the scientific era. It doesn't exist in the medieval Renaissance period. They're not interested in magic. Alchemy is not magic. There's something magical about it, and again, I'll get to that next semester when I deal with the sci-fi trilogy where he talks about Merlin and magic and all that. I'll spend more time on that. But here he noticed simply that we take great interest in magic suddenly when we take interest in science, because our interest in science is not actually interest in knowledge, it's interest in power. So Baconian science is there to gain knowledge of things for the purposes of a certain utility, and the utility is to gain power over the earth. And that desire for power, he says, characterizes much of modern science, and there's something deeply demonic about this. It's gaining power over nature. And it begs the question of what you mean by nature then, of course. We go back to that discussion. Yes? He came into possession of it. Yeah, I don't know how he came across them now. I've forgotten. Yes, and he inherited them, didn't he? Yeah. Right. Right. He was very curious, and so then he experimented with it. And he started with what was it? A hamster? Guinea. Of course it's a guinea pig. What else would it be? Right. And decide, I need to upgrade this experiment. We've tried it on irrational creatures. A child will do. And so again, we get the attitude of the scientist and the experimentation on human beings, which is so much of an issue in Lewis's day, and we get established in the medical community the Nuremberg Code, because scientists had totally gone off the rails during Nazi Germany period, particularly in Nazi Germany, but not just in Nazi Germany. Eugenicist experiments on people were taking place in Canada, in Britain, and the US at the same time. Eugenics was widely idolized. Perfection of human nature through eugenic, selective breeding, and so forth. Tommy Douglas, leader of the Social Credit Party, we revere in Canada for producing the Canada healthcare model and so forth. He's a eugenicist. Did experiments on people. Lots of stuff going on in the not that distant past, which would rather make you blush, or it should at any rate. But experiments on infants, usually orphans. Look at the Duplessis. You ever heard of the Duplessis orphans in Quebec? Lots of experiments on orphans going on. They have no adults to protect them. You know, they're wards of the state. We'll do experiments on them. We'll see. The MK Ultra stuff, again, lots of experimentation on people. And the scientists are doing it for the sake of power, not just of their own power, but the power of humanity. So humanity, this being humanity, this faceless individual is what everything's being done on behalf of. Humanity will benefit from the experiments on these persons who aren't persons anymore because they've had effaced their personal identity, which we associate with their face. We can go ahead with that. And Uncle Andrew represents that. So he's the magician of the title, but he's more of a mad scientist, more like a Victor Frankenstein. He falls into that dystopian science fiction caricature. And I'm going to talk about that next semester again when we look at the sci-fi novel as a precursor to this whole thing, because I do think that Lewis and Tolkien's works of fantasy literature are actually engaging with science fiction and debunking it and critiquing it from a much richer metaphysical and cosmological framework. But he's a mad scientist who's inherited rings with magical powers and knows a bit of the history of magic, but he explicitly calls what he does experiments. So he sees it as a scientist would. He frames it that way. A scientist will be angry at Uncle Andrew, of course. Say, this is no scientist at all, but that's how he sees himself. He's a gentleman scientist, and what does he want from this? He wants to get rich. He wants to get rich, and he wants to get powerful. And he wants to test his ideas. He's got guinea pigs, and he conflates magic and science. And as again, go back to Lewis's observation, science has always conflated its work with magic. It's gaining power over nature, as if nature, the world in which we live, were not creation, who's governed by a creator in whose image we're made, and we're stewards of that creation. Think of how significant the word steward is in Tolkien. But if it's just nature, then it has no origin. It just comes into being, just like Darwinist evolutionary science suggests. It just appears magically. I use that word. But magically, just poof, there you go. It's a miracle. Oh, I didn't mean a miracle. That was, yeah, it's magic. Yeah. So this conflation of magic and science is central to Lewis's thought. It's everywhere. And it's not an attack on science, it's an attack on the character of modern science, which he observes. And we want to observe and emphasize what Uncle Andrew's years as a magician mean to him when he is faced with real magic. So what is this? First of all, the magic, and let me talk about this a bit, the magical power that they have is an infernal power, as it turns out. It comes from the Empress Jadis, who we meet a little bit later on, a precursor to the White Witch. But she's not the White Witch, but she is a infernal power of some sort. I will submit to you to give it a framework that Michael Ward is not seeing. It has the demonic level to it of the multiverse that, again, it's not that he's going to deny it, but it is lacking in this portrait of planet Narnia. What have I got there? I'm going to get rid of this now so I stop confusing things. Yes?
I think it's really interesting that he explicitly says that rules don't apply to him. Like
Correct. The Tao does not apply to him. The rules do not apply to me. Those are for lesser beings.
He has a conversation where he says
with the children.
They can't possibly be expected to apply to profound students and great sages like me.
Like him. Can't possibly be, because they would constrain me in what I want to do. And what I want to do is to benefit man. And how can I benefit man if I see myself as a man? I have to stand and rise above. I have to be an Übermensch, to use Nietzsche's phrase. I have to stand above this, above them all, and be willing to sacrifice them all for the good of them all, even if it means the death of them all. This is the Übermensch perspective, the overman. You've heard me talk about this if you've been in my classes. The Übermensch is a term from, actually from Austrian German, and it's basically from mountaineering, where you knock in the peg metal spike into the mountainside, and then there's a rope that falls beneath. So this is the Übermensch, and this is the Untermensch. Untermenschen, by the way, is the pejorative term for slaves that the Nazis used to describe the non-Aryan races. These are Untermenschen. So it's not just Über and Unter. It's got this idea of the survival of the fittest. This is the Übermensch. And who are the Untermenschen? Everyone else, actually. Anybody and everyone can be sacrificed to the Übermensch. It's Weston's perspective when we come to the sci-fi novels. He's the scientist. Yes?
I also noticed that when Diggory brings up his cruel use of the guinea pigs, he's like, but that's what the creatures were for. I fought for myself.
Right.
Cruelty doesn't.
Pure utilitarian philosophy. He says that's cruel to do this. And note that he is going to reject the moral objection altogether because it serves a higher purpose. And so, interesting, Lewis will write against vivisection. And people say this is a random view. He is opposed to cutting into live bodies. Thinks if we're willing to do this, there will be no limit on what people will do to other people. Like, it seems like an extreme position, and one that is not in keeping with another essay he writes, which is about capital punishment, which he defends. He defends capital punishment, but does not want to allow for vivisection. Totally different discussion as far as he's concerned. Yes? No. He's a petty little man. No. So one of the worst, so this is a great observation, is Uncle Andrew really working on behalf of humanity? He would have to recognize himself as a part of humanity, first of all, to do that. And he would have to have the attributes of a human being which we would look up to. He would be exemplary in that sense. He's exemplary only in one respect, and in his case, it's not particularly prominent either. He has an intellect and a knowledge of science. And this is, again, Lewis's critique of the modern sciences, is they operate without any moral framework. They're not interested in goodness and badness. They don't have an ethical framework that restrains them from doing certain things. They simply have the intellects, and they think that they are in this position and they can do this on behalf of the rest of us. When what they have is no chest, they don't have a face either, but they've got no chests at all. And worse than that, they're motivated by the lust for power, which is what they see when they look out into the horizon here, the sublime, which they see as a reflection of the capacities of their minds, not as something out there. So the greatness all lies within. They're gods, is what it's saying. They determine good and evil. It's the satanic perspective of Genesis 3. Satan offers Eve fruit, and Eve says to the serpent, it's forbidden, and the serpent's offended on their behalf. The great humanitarian Satan, not so, because if you eat this, you'll become as gods, knowing good and evil. She says, oh, okay. Like, it's a very condensed narrative. What's going on in her head there? And she takes it and eats it. And like, that was easy. Boy. But there's a lot going on in that text there. What does that mean? Become as gods. Why is that even tempting? And this is being as a god, determining good and evil. Everything is in accordance with my capacities to frame good and evil. Good and evil are not categories embedded in the created order. They're categories of the mind of practical reason, according to Kant. Yes?
It's also like even not just this like lust for what future power, like the speaks of like I am the great scholar, the magician, and the adaptive who is doing the experiment. Of course, I need subjects, so he sees himself almost as this like
He's the king.
king, and the cruelty that and the experiments that he does is his undone under his authority and his right.
Right, so he's a king and he has subjects, and that's why Queen Jadis will be an appropriate partner for him. Even though he's this pathetic old man and she's this big, beautiful woman, that's a damn fine woman. And she's and she looks at him like, this old man, like, you're not worthy, like, you little old man, whack, But he sees himself in that exalted framework. Now, what he sees himself in, this is interesting, the word in Genesis 1:26, when God creates man in his own image and likeness, that phrase, in imago Dei, is the way that the ancient rulers saw themselves. They bore the image of God. It wasn't applied to humanity in general, it was applied to the leaders. So the Babylonian ruler Nebuchadnezzar would have been a god. But it was only the ruler that bore the image of God. He was one of the gods. And eventually when he died, he would be brought up into the firmament in the heavens. Same thing with Pharaoh. He is God on earth. And the scientist sees himself as he's the only one who bears the image of God, and the way he bears it is in his mind. The way he looks at things and with the power that comes with it, and everyone else. Of course we should serve his agenda, and of course sacrifices need to be made. But I'm not ruled by your obsolete moral objections. That's what Lewis talked about in The Abolition of Man. The man who is motivated by these thoughts will not hesitate eventually to discard the Tao altogether, think it doesn't apply to him, and who knows what he will do with the experiments. That's why I read these books before we come to this, because it really does help explain the psychological and spiritual framework and even the political framework of characters like Uncle Andrew. Like, it's necessary. And note that he wrote that before this. So the chronology is important. The discarded image, not, but the Abolition of Man, yes. He already knows it, he just hasn't written the book. So the magical power of the Empress Jadis, when Diggory and Polly accidentally bring her to our world, is invisible to actual Uncle Andrew. So it's magic. He can't see it, but she can. And when Diggory sees the two of them together, he immediately recognizes what's going on. Diggory does. And then dismisses Uncle Andrew. Him? A magician? Not much. Now, she's the real thing, is what he says. She's the real thing, but him, that's Uncle Andrew. He's just a mean, selfish, absurd old man, calling himself a scientist. This is a young boy's ridicule of the old man, wearing the lab coat, facing outwards and backwards and doing terrible things, and dismissing any moral objections as things below and beneath him, and things that he needs to get beyond. He needs to get beyond the Tao. Now, again, and the educational framework of Lewis's day is promoting this to kids in schools, sixth form. And of course, then education is going to become a major theme of the whole Narnia Chronicles series, which then is no longer about children's literature. It's about what happens to children and how children are seen, and what the purpose of education is, and of meaning and purpose and origins and teleology and metaphysics. All these things get brought into the framework, which is why, even though most scholars think that Lewis's works are not as substantive as Tolkien's, I disagree. I like them both. I don't even want to play that game. Who is superior? There's more going on in the Chronicles of Narnia than it appears. Just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean it's not there. So Diggory dismisses Uncle Andrew, sees that Jadis is the real thing. Uncle Andrew never gets beyond that. And again, once he sees her, he's just like a little boy who's seen this beautiful woman, and he's just sort of like, his tongue sticking out. He's just infatuated by her. And to him, she's a very distinguished person. and the dem fine woman, whatever the English accent is there that Lewis is imagining. Gigantic physics, like an Amazon. And but he's blind to something that motivates her, which is, compared to his desire to dominate everything, it is like a gnat compared to a giant. She desires to dominate everything, the libido dominandi. She wants to dominate all things. She is a satanic character. And she is, in this sense, a sort of a Venus, as would have been worshipped by the ancient world in the form of the goddess Artemis, or Astarte. Same thing that is alluded to in Tolkien, by the way, when Galadriel, she's a queen, represents pure femininity, but femininity that does not desire a sexually opposite complementary type. She just desires to use her beauty for the sake of power over everything. And so she is beautiful, but her beauty, the purpose of her beauty is utilitarian again. It's for power only. That's how she operates. And it's a will to power. And her body is just an expression of a vehicle for her to do that. So it's and Uncle Andrew is totally oblivious to that. It's so far above and beyond him that he's oblivious, but we're not. And when she speaks of her determination to rule our world, or failing that, to destroy it, she really means that. Because she's already done that to her world, Charn. And she rues that. She rues the act, that the name, the word that she spoke to destroy that world, she rues it. But the terrible word, the incantation that brought about the ruin of her world, she will do it again, because there's nothing that will restrain her. So she's pure evil in a sense. I guess not pure evil, because she still is a physical being, but there's something deep. So there's very little good in her, aside from the fact that she was created by Aslan. So the privation of goodness in her is so extreme that she will destroy everything. So she is a satanic figure in that sense. So to Uncle Andrew, this terrifying giant who in our world, even though her powers are greatly diminished, can make animals run mad and break iron lampposts with her bare hands, and that's her weakened power. All he can see is that she's a damn fine woman. She's really hot. Like, it's And either this old man or this is how, and I think Lewis really wants us to see this as a dirty, pathetic old man. So the worst that he can say is, and that's the quote, her behavior and conversation attracted the unfavorable attention of everyone present. She's a little impolite, but we can forgive that. Yes?
I just want to backtrack a little bit. If Jadis was created by Aslan, does that mean that Aslan created more than just Narnia?
Yes.
Oh, interesting.
Because it's the whole multiverse. We don't know anything about that. We leave it alone. But, well, what is Narnia?
Isn't it just the one world, though?
No. There are worlds beneath the worlds through the pool. We don't know anything about those worlds per se, other than that they exist there. You go through the pool and you enter into a different time-space dimension. Which one is Narnia? Narnia is the mirror, or is our particular world that plays itself in time and space, but there's something beyond our planet of Earth that exists in time and space, the other planets, for instance. So Narnia is a reflection of the Earth and what happens on the Earth, namely the incarnation.
I guess I was just thinking that if Aslan did create Jadis, that probably would have come up somewhere in the book, but I don't.
He doesn't deal. No, it doesn't. He doesn't deal with the creation of Jadis. No, he doesn't speak of that in Narnia. But it's there. Where did she come from then? It's not told. She's just there. Right? We do have as I say, a scene of the temptation and the fall here in this book, but we don't have that scene where Jadis would have been in a different dimension, a different time, in a different place. That's not mentioned, but it must be there because she's the means of evil that comes into our world from a different dimension. It's not just a different dimension, it's a different multiverse. Just alluded to. Yes? Correct. Where did they come from? Another world altogether. So it's just there. He doesn't give us much more than that, other than that it exists. And occasionally there's a bit of overlap, but we're only going to deal with the area that is of Narnia, where is the main area of interest, and it's the area that bears correspondence to our worlds that Lewis is writing in. But that is an imaginary world, or is it? We'll have to get to that later on, but yes. Yes. Oh, I think he's the creator. Like he's the creator of Jadis as well. All the bridges are portals, and they're different portals. One of them is a ring. Right? Think of the significance of rings. In the Lord of the Rings, it pulls you into a different dimension. You put it on and you become invisible and you can see other things. So the ring there has a certain correspondence to this ring, but this ring is a little bit different altogether. This little pulls you into a different dimension. Like if you touch it and keep it in your pocket, but if you put it on or grasp hold of it with your hand, it takes you there. That's a little bit like Tolkien, but he extends it to a multiverse. Tolkien has no interest in multiverses, so he's not engaging. So don't read Lewis engaging on the same level that Tolkien is. Tolkien is really comparing the romantic worldview of his contemporaries and the critique of modern science and so forth, yes, to the one in which he would be most familiar, that of the Ptolemaic cosmology and so forth. But he's not engaging on the level of multiverses or a stern critique of scientism and the moral objection to it to the same degree and at the same level Lewis is, let alone critiquing the current academic establishment, which is predicated on this view. but Lewis is. So is Lewis a superior writer to Tolkien on that? And I think, yes, on this front he is, in that sense. Doesn't make him a better read, a better writer of fiction, but there is a level here which is complicated and rich. Did you want to, Maddie? Or, no.
When you wrote the last novel too, I think the first time I read it, I was surprised that when they went into the real Narnia, you could also see the real London.
Yeah.
Like our world in Narnia, they were just together on different hills, which is kind of cool. And I don't think I expected that when I was little, but he was pointing out the different places and the different behaviors you could just kind of see
Yep.
around, which is kind of cool.
It's interesting, but it's to some degree perspectivalism, like it's here, right? But it's more than perspectivalism that's being, it's not just you could see it this way, you could be that way, and neither of them is correct. He suggests there is a correct way to see it, and Narnia is the correct. There's something that's correct about that because the moral law is still held to there entirely. All the characters recognize the moral law. They might be fighting against it. There's good and evil, but it still governs the actions of all the characters. Whereas in our world, it doesn't. That's how bad our world is. And that's actually the implied criticism of the scientific world, is that it is no longer governed by the Tao. It's post-Christian. It's post-human. Yes? And
Going back to Aslan being more than just the creator of Narnia, even in chapter 15, it starts with, "You need no ring to my home," and Aslan brings them into the wood.
right.
And so he's in that space between all the worlds. And
Yes.
he's able to bring them there, which gives a sense of he has power over all of them.
Created order and all of it, all the different worlds at all times. And there are little portals that are found, and the wardrobe is only one of them. There are other ways the Tellermeans can come in through a different, like a cave, but that will also disappear. It's there for a time and then it's not there anymore. So yeah, and it's there, but it's not always going to be there, and it will disappear furthermore. It's there for a certain period of time, and we'll hear about that. Just like in the Odyssey, the Phaeacians exist between the gods, the Olympian gods, and men. There's this sort of island somewhere where Phaeacians are, and they allow him transport from one place to the next through their, and then Poseidon's so angry, they says that can never happen again. They say, okay, so then that world disappears, because that's Zeus, the politician, placating his brother Poseidon, say, okay, we won't, I'll get rid of that portal. That's not going to happen again. Okay, you really given up a lot of power there. I'll accept that. Did you already moved on? Okay. But note, I said at the beginning, and it's too interesting. Lewis is writing The Magician's Nephew precisely at the same time he's writing Surprised by Joy. And it's important, and there is a personal connection in the story with Diggory as well. So we begin by seeing a blubbing Diggory, tears streaming down his face. And Diggory, when we first meet him, he's crying, and he's so miserable he doesn't even care that other people know it. Now, boys usually don't want to be seen crying. But now he's so sad that he doesn't even care if a girl sees it, and he's willing to admit it. That's how he's lost his sort of self-respect in all of this. And he says to her, and you would, so would you if you'd lived all your life in the country and had a pony and a river at the bottom of the garden, and then had been brought to live in a beastly hole like this. And if your father was away in India, and you had to come and live with an aunt and an uncle who's mad, how would you like that? And if the reason was that they're looking after your mother, and your mother was ill and was going to die, then his face went the wrong sort of shape, as it does if you're trying to keep back your tears. Mother, by the way, here is a proper name. He calls her mother. It's not just that she is his mother, it's mother. She has a significance that she's identified with mother. This is a deep, now he's not a Freudian, he's not reading at things, but there's a deep significance to the boy and loss that Lewis is touching on, which I don't think it's autobiographical, but it does touch the point in his life where he lost his mother. And his father sent him overseas. His dad couldn't take care of him. He sent him to the boarding schools that he hated. Lewis prays for his mother's healing, by the way. This is why he turns away from the Christian faith. He prays for his mother's healing. She does not heal. She dies. He's angry. He's an angry boy. He carries that with him until his conversion. Whereas Diggory does not pray for his healing. So don't, if you're going to see it as Diggory is Lewis or something like that, I think that falls rather short of the portrait here. And there's nothing Christian about the story. Again, people say this is a Christian telling. Well, the characters aren't Christian. Diggory's not Christian. And there's little evidence of anything. So the cabbie here, who becomes King Frank, the first king of Narnia, he sings hymns, but it's more like it's cultural Christianity. He doesn't seem to be particularly convicted about the lordship of Jesus Christ or the importance of the atonement or his faith in God. And like, it's just, he's heard hymns when he was young and he still remembers them. And he's good. There's something deeply good about this man. So this is maybe more of his rural Anglican upbringing than anything else. But it's not prominent in Frank's life. It's not because he's the best Christian that he becomes the first king of Narnia. It's because he seems to have although he's uneducated, note how telling that is, his sensibilities are good. The Tao guides him in his prudential choices. But so that's how it begins. And when Diggory does not pray, and until a certain point of the point, he does not even seem to hope. He just takes his mother's going to die as a given, and there's no way around it. Now the temptation will come when there's a possible solution offered to this terrible outcome, which he thinks is inescapable. We can stop your mom from dying. I can do this. Temptation is huge. Power of life and death. I can give you the power that she won't die. And how he responds to that then will determine everything that happens thereafter. Fascinating story in that sense. Does he give in to the temptation? His mom means everything to him. But then he meets Aslan. And Aslan has a deep significance to him they can't even put in words entirely. It can't entirely articulate what Aslan means, but he knows that there's something more to him than this big fuzzy lion. Much more. And so let me find my notes here. And what it is he represents goodness. And the thing that moves him, however, is not the goodness of the lion, it's the compassion of the lion. When the lion, he sees the tear of the lion at the death of his mother and the meaning of how deeply it hurts him, it moves him to not want to disappoint the lion. He knows it's wrong. He knows that this vantage point is wrong. He can't discount everyone and everything else just because of his own grief and his own desire to control things. He's going to submit himself to a power above him and beyond him, under which and recognize that he is ruled by the Tao. You can't contradict goodness and get a good outcome here, even though he's going to save his mother. And so that is a scene of temptation which he passes, which is an extraordinary thing. So it's not a recounting of Paradise Lost. That's there. We'll get that in the story, but he passes the test. And because he passes the test, he becomes a significant figure in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He becomes the wise uncle that can give guidance, right? So it's about choices, but the choices there is to, I guess we'll say, make Christ his savior, to make him his Lord, to be governed by right and wrong, and not be willing to take consequences for actions into his own hands, which this guy is always going to do, even if it costs his mother her life. And then, of course, Aslan provides him a means of rectifying her death and so forth, which he would not have had if he had thwarted his mother's death and given her the apple that would have healed her. He would not have had that. But the effect of it is greater than what it does for his mother. It's what it does to him. That's the most important thing here. Aslan can take care of that situation here. What he can't take care of is the consequence of this boy's actions on himself. So doing the good for the sake of the good, even if it has a bad outcome for you and you're going to die or your mother's going to die and everything that you hold dear is going to fall as a consequence, but doing it because it's right is what Lewis is commending us to us in this book. And note that it's motivated by love, but it's a greater love than the love he has for his mother, which is a very strong love. It's storge, it's the familiar love. For young children, it's the strongest of all loves. Familiarity. Mum. Mother. Right? The kids following mum around, the apple of the kid's eye. Mum. Follow mum. This is a young boy for whom mum is everything. Mother. Capitalized. And yet the agape love of Aslan norms the maternal love that Diggory feels. And by setting those things in the right order, he becomes a transformed character. So subtly done. As I say, it does seem to draw on Lewis's own experience of losing his mother Flora, but again, it's very different because, again, Diggory doesn't even pray. And yet, God works in his character's life in mysterious ways. And Lewis's own coming to faith is a mysterious way. Anyway, I have not even scratched the surface on this novel anyway, but I hope I gave you something of why I think it's such an important work and why it becomes the first one and why it's called The Magician's Nephew even, and why that's relevant to science and the whole framework of the novel, and why science is also part of the whole cosmology of Narnia, because I do think it's a multiverse cosmology. And that's significant here. Anyway, we're done for today.